I'm John Batchelor. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, is here. We turn to national parks. 100 years old. Happy birthday, national parks. In fact, we've just passed National Park Week. And what is to be done? What are the concerns? We welcome Shawn Regan of the Property and Environmental Research Center, PERC, in Bozeman, Montana. Shawn, writing most recently in the Wall Street Journal editorial page, he's a former National Park Service ranger, so he speaks from a point of view of we want this to win, the national parks. Shawn, a very good evening to you. We're looking for your colleague Terry Anderson, who is on the road, and we'll get him soon enough. Your piece, I want to go right to it. What's wrong with the national parks is everything. Deferred maintenance is the polite way of putting it. Does the federal government have a plan to correct what has long been needed and that the abuse has reached catastrophic limits? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Thanks for having me. So the Park Service is celebrating its 100-year anniversary later this year, as you mentioned, and the reality is that the Park Service will enter its second century with a $12 billion backlog in deferred maintenance, and that's an amount that's 5 times higher than their latest budget from Congress. And so deferred maintenance here refers to critical needs such as roads, infrastructure, trails, other park facilities, wastewater systems, things of that sort that are necessary for visitors to access parks and to enjoy parks. And that infrastructure, those trails, those wastewater systems are crumbling. And so the Park Service faces a major challenge as it enters its second century with this massive backlog, and really in terms of the size of it, just no real practical solutions in sight.
Shawn, what about funding? Where do these national parks get their money from? Is it the fee you pay at the visitor center? How do we give money to these folks? Yeah,
that's a great question. It's the vast majority of funding for national parks comes from Congress. There are fees, as you mentioned, and if your listeners have been to some of the major parks, you often pay an entrance fee when you enter the park, and that does go to fund the agency. Some of it stays within the park unit where it was collected. Some of it goes agency-wide to different parks. And that's a recent development in the history of the Park Service, that the agency can retain some of those revenues and deal with some of these maintenance challenges apart from relying on Congress. But that doesn't total much more than, say, 10% on average of the park's total budget. The vast majority is congressional appropriations.
Well, I hesitate to even ask about money, because when you think of the federal government and how they spend money, it's never spent very productively or efficiently. I assume it's the same for the national parks.
Right, and that's really how we got into this situation today, where we face this $12 billion backlog, is that it's just not politically feasible for politicians to fund the types of infrastructure, wastewater system needs that exist on these public lands. They'd rather create new parks. They'd rather hold a ribbon cutting ceremony rather than the mundane, routine maintenance that's often what's needed at the park level. And so when it comes to fees, we talked about fees and how they can they're often kept within the individual parks. What we see is when those fees are kept within the parks themselves and they don't go back to D.C., if they stay within the individual park, the park managers often spend those funds on the critical maintenance challenges that exist. So what we see is that the politicians don't have the right incentives to maintain these areas. One of the things I mentioned in my piece is we need to affirm and allow greater flexibility for park managers to charge fees, user fees, because those revenues can self-sustain the agencies to a large extent, and if they can be kept at the park level, park managers know best what to spend those revenues on rather than Congress.
We welcome Shawn's colleague at PERC, Terry Anderson, who's on the road. Terry, a very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. Happy birthday, National Parks, and let's get to the remedy. What is a public-private partnership? How would that work to help the national parks repair the damage and grow? Good evening to you, Terry.
And good evening, John, Mary, and Shawn. Let me just add one point to Shawn's last one, and it is that, the Park Service is battling for funds where they're up against other agencies like the Veterans Administration, and they've got backlogs. They have hospitals that need repairing, and even though the taxpayer loves the national parks, when it gets right down to it, are they going to put it into a sewer in Yosemite or a new VA hospital for people returning from the Middle East? It's a tough one for the parks to win. There are lots of really good ways to bring the private sector incentives to bear on parks. One is private-public partnerships. There are parks where the private sector is already involved in management and in supplying services, and we think more could be done with that. Shawn and I have worked along with our colleague Holly Fretwell on an idea of franchising parks. Idea would be that a park would be like any other franchise in the private sector, would operate under the banner of the National Park Service, have all the imprimatur that the Park Service has, but it would be required to pay the cost, and it would charge fees. It would collect them, and to Mary's question of Shawn, it would mean that the managers would have a lot more flexibility of the kind Shawn was talking about.
Well, it seems like these would be attractive places for private business. Terry, I recall a vacation a couple of years ago. I took to Glacier, and I went into one of the hotels on the parklands, and it was a stunning view, and the hotel was pretty on the outside, but man, it was not pretty on the inside. And I thought, geez, people would pay top dollar to be in this location if you had some decent accommodation.
I often like to make sure everyone understands that the phrase America's parks are America's best idea, and the National Park Service takes credit for that. In fact, national parks were the brainchild mostly of the railroads. In the late 1800s, when the Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Southern Pacific were coming across the country, they saw parks as a destination for tourists and therefore profits. They built, maybe the one you were in, they built these magnificent hotels, and now many of these hotels become a burden in that they're the ones that are dumping sewage and so on. And so I think we need to return to just what you said. How can we get the private sector and private-public partnerships to take over some of these operations? And it means they're likely to be expensive. If you want a tent camp, well, you can get one of those, but you're going to pay top dollar for that view and for the quality, but people are willing to. It's, a lot of wealthy people go to these parks, and they can afford it.
Shawn, is there a conversation anywhere in Washington about experimenting with one park or more for new ways to raise revenue? Do the park service managers and overlords, do they welcome new ideas, or have they closed their doors?
What we like to say at PERC is that free market environmentalism, which is what we do here at PERC, free market environmentalism can make what Terry referred to as America's best idea even better. And we think there's a lot of things that Congress can do. I would say that the fee, the retained receipts, the ability of park agencies, individual parks to retain the revenues that are collected at the individual parks and use those revenues within that park is a positive development that we've seen in the last decade or so, and that's something that needs to continue, and it's really rooted in some of these same ideas. And I'd say there's positive developments going on. I mean, right here in Montana, there's the American Prairie Reserve is demonstrating how this sort of model could be implemented. Now, this isn't an official Park Service unit. It's rather it's a nonprofit that's purchasing lands and relying on private philanthropy to create a nature reserve that's open to the public in eastern Montana on the prairies. And I think that's evidence that the private sector can do these sorts of things, can run these sorts of parks in an efficient way. And we want to find more ways of using those ideas within the Park Service model, and we think there's a lot of potential there.
Terry, what about the members of Congress whose congressional districts include national parks? Are they a positive or negative? Are they looking to innovate?
By and large, they aren't innovative. They see the parks as a place to bring more money to the state through tourism, and they often talk about the multiplier effect of the tourism. And their goal is to help build up those towns that are around parks mostly, and so they'll lobby for more money for the parks in their district. But as Shawn said earlier, they're not interested in putting in a new sewage system. So they're not the place to start. I would say, however, that this idea of just charging fees and keeping them in the park started at PERC 20 years ago, and we got some congressional staffers saying this might work, and it's now implemented, and we think it could do more. Just last week, Shawn and I had an email from a Native American from the Pit River tribe in California saying, man, could we use this franchising idea for the tribe to take over its ancestral lands included in Mount Lassen Volcano National Park? So he was very interested in being innovative. And last year we met with the superintendent of Yellowstone, and when we talked to him about higher fees and supported him in their efforts to raise the fees all the way to a whopping $30, he was just pleased to have the support. So, I think there are a few people out there who see that the problem is so bad we need to do something, but they aren't for the most part, they're not the politicians in Washington.
Just quickly, Shawn, is there a timeline here before there's catastrophic failure, before somebody's hurt? You talk about drinking water. Certainly roads can lead to very bad accidents.
Right. I mean, we're talking about sewer systems here that have already spilled raw sewage into rivers and streams that are in parks. Yosemite is an example where that's happened recently. Yellowstone, that's happened. And the Park Service recognizes that these are major challenges. As we point out, though, relying on Congress for appropriations is not the answer.
Right.
In fact, it's part of the problem because they are not interested in funding these sorts of things. The Park Service needs to find ways to be more self-sufficient to promote this Park Service idea into the second century.
Terry Anderson and Shawn Regan, both of the Property Environmental Research Center in PERC in Bozeman, Montana. Terry's also at the Hoover Institution. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. I'm John Batchelor.